We hear the word terrorism a lot, despite the fact that it is a term that is notoriously hard to explain. There is no international consensus on the definition, legally or academically, for the term terrorist. In fact, the U.S. government has more than 20 definitions for it. And in 1996, the UN formed its own ad hoc committee to draft an official explanation of the term, and that took 10 years. So what exactly constitutes terrorism? A mix of those definitions results in something like this. Terrorism is violence, or the threat of violence, against non-combatants or civilians, usually motivated by political, religious, or ideological beliefs. Outside of that broad definition, it might be better to explain terrorism by talking about what it's not. Terrorism is not organized crime. There are a few key differences. One is motivation. Terrorism is usually politically or socially motivated. Organized crime is profit motivated. Secondly, people in organized crime don't usually seek media attention, something terrorists do. Third, organized crime doesn't usually desire government recognition, unlike most terrorist groups. Terrorism is not violence carried out by one mentally ill person. This can be confusing because when it comes to violent acts, it's not immediately apparent who is sane and who is insane. For example, Mon Haran Monis took hostages in an Australian cafe in December 2014. He claimed that it was an official attack on Australia by the Islamic State. However, after the siege ended, many people, like the Australia Prime Minister, agreed that he was a mentally ill person and could not be considered a terrorist. Monis was killed in the siege, and his true intentions and affiliations remain unknown. Research shows that 40% of lone wolf attacks are perpetrated by mentally ill individuals. Terrorism is not violence perpetrated by a government against another nation. If a nation commits an act of violence, it is usually referred to as an act of war, or under certain circumstances, an act of self-defense. There are some exceptions to this rule. If a nation indirectly commits an act of terrorism by funding a terrorist organization or covertly organizing a terrorist act, that is still considered by some, like the United States, to be a terrorist action. Terrorism is also not an act of violence by a government against its own people. Nations like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia had a history of terrorizing their own civilians, but those were generally considered to be acts of oppression or repression and not terrorism. These definitions are based on how the UN, the US, and many international scholars interpret these terms. If you disagree or have a dissenting opinion, you're not alone. As we said at the top of this, terrorism is notoriously hard to define and often used to mean many different things by pundits, politicians, and the media. If you want to know more, watch this video on why terrorist groups can't last forever.
The most common reason a terrorist group stops committing terrorism is because they eventually become a political party.
Thanks for watching, and please subscribe. We put out new videos 6 days a week.